The sun fell slow over Redstone, turning the street to copper and the windows to fire. A crowd gathered near the gallows, boots grinding dust into a low fog. Margaret Kane tied her horse beside the saloon and listened, uneasy. Jeers rose like crows, ugly and hungry. A voice cut through, young yet steady, pleading, "Please, I am begging you, untie it." She pushed forward under a brim dark with travel and saw him bound to a post, wrists raw, shoulders sagging, eyes unbroken. The sheriff hovered like a vulture. Judge Holston unfolded charges that sounded polished and rotten. Tonight, pale rope coiled near the post, like a snake waiting to strike. Holston's voice rolled smooth as river clay, promising order, offering cruelty. He called the prisoner a thief, a liar, a trespasser against decent folks. The young man met the accusations with silence that felt heavier than any shout. Margaret studied him through dust. He was Apache, bruised, tired, too proud to beg. The sheriff tightened the knot, and the crowd pressed closer, hungry for a story that made them feel safe. Margaret's stomach hardened. She had heard of Holston's deeds, lands taken with papers forged and threats whispered. Holston lifted a hand, and the noise thinned to a hush. The young man raised his chin and spoke clearly, voice rough but anchored. "I did not steal. I found what he hides. He fears light and truth." A ripple moved through the crowd like wind across wheat, then stiffened again under Holston's glare. "Liar," the judge growled, and even the sheriff looked away. Margaret felt heat rise under her collar. She had ridden long enough to smell rot beneath perfume. Yet one word from her could turn the mob. She swallowed anger, memorized knots, and stepped into shadow. Night found Margaret on the edge of town beside a fire, coffee bitter as medicine in her tin cup. The words would not quit circling her thoughts, like coyotes testing a fence. "I found what he hides." She pictured rawhide carving wrists, the quiet courage in his stare, the judge's smooth venom. Dusty cropped weeds nearby, tail flicking. Margaret set the cup down, felt the weight of her revolver like a promise at her hip. No one would stand up for him. So she would. She planned in silence, braided risk with resolve, and waited for the moon to rise. Near midnight, the street lay empty except for swinging signs and a dog scratching fleas by the livery. Margaret kept to alleys, counting windows, measuring shadows. The jailhouse sat square as a sermon, lantern burning low inside. She tested the barred window with careful fingers, then tapped once. A shape stirred. The Apache lifted his head, eyes narrow with pain and suspicion. "Why?" he whispered. "Because I believe you," she answered, voice barely sound. She slid a small knife through the bars, watched his fingers work the knots, then teased the lock with wire until it surrendered like tired bone. The door sighed open, footsteps creaked in a hallway, then quiet settled again. Margaret pressed a finger to her lips and led him into the alley, moving like ghosts between stacked crates. Dusty waited patient, reins looped low. She mounted, reached down, and gripped his forearm. He hesitated only a heartbeat before swinging up behind her. They rode without spur or word, hooves muffled by forgiving sand. Behind them, Redstone slept inside its lies. Ahead, the desert opened. Cold stars thrown across black sky, like salt. Margaret kept Dusty steady, feeling the man's exhaustion lean into her back like truth. Dawn found them among wind-carved rocks. Margaret slid from the saddle, legs shaking, and helped him down. He moved stiffly, breath tight, wrists marked by rawhide. She handed water and tore cloth from her sleeve, binding angry grooves with care steady as churchwork. He watched her, measuring. "My name is Tahu," he said at last. "I owe you." Margaret shook her head. "Save thanks for later. They will ride hard today." He nodded, eyes still wary, yet warmer. She passed jerky, broke it with her teeth when his strength failed, then kept watch while he slept a little longer. When he woke, they shared the shade and the little food she had left. Voices will follow, she warned. Holston will not forgive a public failure. Tahu studied the horizon, jaw tightening. I searched his coach after he took our land claims, he said. Papers prove he forged signatures, stole water rights, and sold grazing to his friends. I carried them to the mission. His men found me first. Margaret felt anger prick like thistles. Proof would hang a king if a town dared. In Redstone, kings wore robes of law. She wrapped the bandage tighter and planned northward routes. By late morning, a dust plume smeared the southern sky. Riders, Margaret said softly. Tahu rose, tested his legs, and nodded. They moved from rock to rock, letting the land swallow their trail. Margaret led Dusty through a dry wash, brushing prints with a mesquite branch. Heat pressed like iron against their backs, but the wash funneled wind enough to hide sound. Near noon, voices drifted close and passed on, impatient, overconfident. Margaret waited until the desert settled, then pressed forward. She no longer felt alone. She felt responsible. Responsibility, she knew, was heavier than loneliness, and twice as stubborn. That evening they camped near a low bluff where wind could not pry heat from the small fire. Margaret brewed coffee, thin as honesty, and listened while Tahu spoke of his mother's corn beside a river now fenced by strangers. He spoke of promises broken by ink and seal, of water sold back to those who first found it. Margaret told him little of herself, only that grief had carved her quiet, and work had kept the pieces together. The stars came out, bright needles sewing the night. For the first time, their silence felt shared rather than empty tonight. In the morning, Margaret drew lines in dust with a stick. "We need the papers from the mission," she said. "If they speak, the judge must answer." Tahu nodded slowly. "My uncle hid them beneath loose stones behind the chapel. I never reached him." Margaret packed the fire, saddled Dusty, and handed Tahu a canteen. "If we move by arroyos and ride at dusk, we can beat their temper." He smiled at that, small but real. She felt it warming places grief had left cold. Truth was a hard horse, but if ridden well, it could outrun fear and rumor. They kept a broken country that chewed hooves and hid lives. Vultures circled high, measuring chances. Twice they lay still while riders crossed a ridge above, laughter falling like stones. Margaret marked the sun by shadows and sipped water only when Dusty drank. Tahu limped less each mile, strength returning in stubborn layers. Near sunset they saw the mission's white wall cradle a patch of mesquite and a tired bell. Smoke rose thin from a cook fire. No guards. No sign of Holston yet. Margaret let breath out slow, then tightened it again. Safety is often just a quieter danger waiting. After dark they slipped behind the chapel, feet silent on crushed shells. Tahu knelt at a limestone seam and pried one loose stone free. Then another. A wrapped bundle slid into his hands. He opened it with care. Inside lay deeds, water charters, and a note in an elder hand. "If you read this, take these papers to the territorial marshal. Do not trust the judge or the sheriff." Tahu swallowed hard. My uncle knew they would come. Margaret placed the bundle inside her coat. "We ride at dawn," she said. The bell tolled once, soft as a warning prayer. Dawn painted the mission walls pink when hoofbeats thundered from the south. Holston's men spilled into the yard, loud with confidence. Margaret cursed under breath and shoved the bundle deeper inside her coat. Dusty sprang forward as she vaulted into the saddle and hauled Tahu up behind. Shots cracked, bells clanged, pigeons exploded like smoke. They burst through mesquite, thorns ripping cloth, bullets tearing leaves. Margaret leaned low, feeling Tahu's arm steady her waist. The land pitched and rolled, and she let it choose their path. Behind them, voices tangled with metal. Ahead, The wash opened like a held breath. The wash swallowed sound, turned gunfire to distant rain. Margaret urged Dusty into the twisting channel, hooves scattering stones. Tahu pointed left, where a cattle trail climbed a limestone lip hidden by brush. Up, he said, breath ragged. They scrambled, sliding, then broke onto a shelf above the basin. From there, the mission shrank to a pale thumbprint. Riders milled below, searching wrong directions, cursing heat and thorns. Margaret laughed once, harsh and relieved. Tahu's hand stayed at her waist longer than needed. She did not pull away. The shelf ran north like a secret road only patience revealed today. By noon, they found a narrow slot canyon where heat could not fully reach. Dusty drank from a shaded seep, sides heaving. Margaret unpinned the bundle, counted pages, and wrapped them again inside oiled cloth. Tahu watched her hands, steady as a clockmaker. "You trust me with your life," he said softly. "Trust these pages with mine." She met his eyes, surprised by the gentleness there. She nodded. He smiled from somewhere deep. They ate in silence, sharing dried peaches and crumbs. Wind moved high above, like distant surf. Rest was short, but it stitched bravery back into tired muscles. They rode again at dusk, letting purple shadows guide them. The territorial marshal kept an office near a telegraph station. 2 days' ride if luck held. Luck, Margaret knew, was a horse that threw most riders. Still, they pressed on, skirting ranch roads and dry lakes. Coyotes trotted parallel like questions. On the second night, lanterns winked from a lonely outpost framed by cottonwoods. Margaret felt her shoulders drop an inch. Tahu exhaled like a man tasting rain. Inside, a clerk blinked at their dust, then fetched the marshal, a lean woman with iron hair who listened without blinking once. Margaret laid the papers out like a careful hand of cards. Deeds, charters, sworn statements, maps redrawn to steal water and fence rivers. Tahu added his uncle's note and the journal he had copied by memory between beatings. The marshal read, "Jaw-hardening. I have waited for a spark," she said. "This will do." She drafted warrants that night, telegraphed deputies upriver, and poured coffee that could stand a spoon. "You will both testify," she added. "It will be dangerous." Margaret nodded. Tahu nodded. "Truth is worth bruises," Margaret said. The marshal smiled thinly. "Truth is worth jails too sometimes." At dawn, deputies rode hard for Redstone, papers folded like knives in their pockets. By noon, Holston stood on his own porch, pale beneath parade manners, while the warrants read like scripture. The sheriff tried to swagger, then wilted under the marshal's stare. Townsfolk gathered, their certainty leaking away in the Sunday some shouted. Others watched quietly, remembering small harms that suddenly made sense. Margaret stood beside Tahu on the edge of the crowd, dust on her boots, relief catching her ribs. She felt the world tilt. Not much, just enough to let breath move where it had been held. That night, Margaret and Tahu sat on the low step outside the marshal's office, shoulders brushing, coffee cooling between their hands. The town sounded different, as if a tight drum had finally slackened. Wind moved through cottonwoods and carried the smell of rain from far hills. Tahu said little. He did not need to. Margaret watched Dusty doze and felt the ache of long years ease an inch. She had broken a rope and a habit. She had chosen a side and found company there. Tomorrow would bring courtrooms and testimony. Tonight brought quiet. For once, quiet felt like victory. The days after Holston's arrest were tense and uncertain. Redstone was a town built on whispers, and now every whisper carried Margaret's name. Some cursed her for siding with an Apache. Others looked at her with a new respect, as though she had cracked the wall of fear that Holston had built. Margaret ignored both camps, keeping to the marshal's office, standing watch at night with her revolver on her hip. She had faced mobs before, but never with so much at stake. The papers had given proof, but proof was fragile. It needed a courtroom to become truth. The courthouse smelled of dust, ink, and sweat. Margaret sat beside Tahu at the witness table, the marshal standing behind them like a wall of steel. Holston sat across the room, shackled but smirking, his lawyers polished like coins. The judge assigned to preside came from another county, which gave Margaret hope. When called, she stood tall, hat in her hands, voice steady. She told of the night she saw injustice in Redstone Street, of rawhide ropes, of a man punished for exposing fraud. The crowd behind her murmured, divided, but her words struck like nails driven into wood. Tahu spoke next. His voice carried the rhythm of rivers, quiet but unbroken. He told of his uncle, of land stolen, of promises bent into chains. He held nothing back, even when the lawyers tried to twist his words. The marshal placed each document before the judge, each deed marked with Holston's false seal. By the time the last page was read, the smirk on Holston's face had begun to fray. Still, Margaret could feel the crowd restless, divided between those who saw justice and those who clung to prejudice like a lifeline. The desert air outside grew heavy. When the verdict came, it was both relief and storm. Holston was sentenced to years in prison, stripped of office and land. But the moment the gavel fell, shouts rose in the gallery. Men loyal to him spat curses, fists shaken, threats hurled at Margaret and Tahu. The marshal's deputies held them back, but the anger didn't die. It scattered into alleys and ranch houses, ready to fester. Margaret felt it like a weight in her chest. She knew this wasn't the end. Truth had won, but truth was dangerous. In a land that preferred lies, she prepared for the aftermath. That night, Margaret stayed at her ranch outside town. The stars were sharp, the air restless. She cleaned her revolver by lantern light, listening to Dusty's calm breathing in the corral. Tahu sat nearby, silent for a long time before speaking. "You risked your life for me. You risk it still." Margaret looked up, her eyes shadowed by the brim of her hat. "I don't regret it." He studied her face, then nodded. No more words were needed. In silence, they shared coffee, both knowing the desert carried dangers sharper than bullets. Some of those dangers wore familiar boots. 2 nights later, trouble came. Margaret woke to Dusty's frantic whinnying. She grabbed her rifle and stepped outside, boots crunching dirt. 3 figures on horseback circled the corral, torches in their hands. "Traitor!" one shouted. "We don't take orders from marshals or savages." Flames licked toward the fence. Margaret fired a warning shot into the air. The men scattered like coyotes, but their laughter echoed back. "You'll regret it, Kane." Margaret lowered the rifle, jaw tight. Tahu appeared beside her, eyes blazing. "They'll keep coming," he said. She nodded. "Then we'll be ready." The night smelled of smoke and challenge. The days that followed turned Margaret's ranch into a fortress. She and Tahu worked side by side, mending fences, setting traps, keeping watch. Word spread that her place was dangerous ground for anyone loyal to Holston. Some neighbors offered quiet support, bringing supplies under cover of darkness. Others turned away, afraid to be seen near her land. Margaret didn't blame them. Fear was a stronger currency than gold, but she found strength in Tahu's steady presence. Together they made the desert feel less empty, less cruel. For the first time in years, Margaret didn't ride alone. That changed everything. One afternoon, while checking the far pasture, Dusty suddenly pricked his ears and stopped. Tahu dismounted first, scanning the horizon. "Riders," he said softly. A plume of dust rose from the south. Margaret's stomach tightened. She counted at least 5 horses. Too many for a visit. She cocked her rifle. "Best we let them know we're not easy prey." They took cover behind boulders, rifles ready. When the riders drew near, one raised his hand. not with a gun, but in peace. Margaret squinted. It was Deputy Howard, a loyal man of the marshal. "We come with news," he called. Howard dismounted, his face grave. "Holston's allies ain't done. They plan to free him during the transfer to prison. They're gathering men in the canyon pass." Margaret cursed under her breath. Tahu's jaw tightened. "If he escapes, everything we risked means nothing." Howard nodded. "Marshall asked me to find you. She needs riders she can trust." Margaret felt the choice tighten around her throat. She had wanted only to survive, to mind her own land. But justice wasn't a seed you could plant and ignore. It had to be watered with courage. She looked at Tahu. "We ride at dawn." The canyon pass was a place of shadows, where red cliffs narrowed into a throat of stone. Margaret and Tahu arrived with Howard's men before first light, setting up ambush points along the ridges. The air smelled of dust and gunpowder waiting to ignite. Margaret crouched behind a boulder, rifle steady. Beside her, Tahu's eyes scanned the horizon, calm but fierce. When the sound of hooves thundered from the east, every muscle in Margaret's body tightened. Holston's allies came fast, faces wrapped in scarves, guns gleaming. At their center, a wagon rattled, carrying the disgraced judge bound in chains. For now, the battle came swift and brutal. Gunfire cracked, ricocheting off stone. Horses screamed, men shouted. Margaret fired twice, dropping riders before they reached the wagon. Tahu's aim was steady, every shot deliberate. Howard's men fought with grit, but the attackers were desperate, wild with loyalty to their fallen master. Amid the chaos, Margaret saw two men break for the wagon, axes swinging to smash the lock. She charged down the slope, bullets buzzing past her ears. Dusty thundered behind her, loyal as always. Margaret swung her rifle like a club, knocking one man sprawling. Tahu fired, dropping the other. When the smoke cleared, silence settled heavy. Bodies lay scattered, horses trembling. Holston sat in the wagon, his face twisted with rage and fear. Margaret stood over him, rifle aimed steady. "It's done," she said coldly. He spat at her boots, but his smirk was gone. Howard's deputies secured him tighter, this time under heavier guard. The marshal herself rode in moments later, surveying the scene with grim satisfaction. "You did good," she told Margaret. Margaret only nodded. She didn't feel like celebrating. She felt tired, carved hollow by the weight of choices. But Tahu's hand on her shoulder steadied her. The ride back to Redstone was quiet. Margaret kept her gaze on the horizon, the desert stretching endless, but no longer empty. Tahu rode beside her, his silence a comfort rather than a burden. When they returned, the town greeted them not with cheers, but with watchful eyes. Respect had begun to replace fear, though prejudice lingered like smoke after fire. Margaret didn't seek thanks. She had never lived for others' approval. She only wanted peace. Yet deep down, she knew peace wasn't given, it was made, earned, defended. She and Tahu had begun something that would not end easily. That night, Margaret sat on her porch, lantern casting soft light on weathered boards. Tahu joined her, 2 mugs of coffee steaming between them. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Margaret broke the silence. "When I freed you that night, I didn't think beyond tomorrow, but tomorrow kept coming." Tahu smiled faintly, his eyes reflecting the stars. "And now?" She looked out at the desert, vast and untamed. "Now I think maybe I don't have to face it alone." Tahu's hand brushed hers, brief but certain. The desert night carried their silence, warm as any promise spoken aloud. Weeks passed, and though threats still lingered, life began to steady. Margaret's ranch bore new fences, stronger than before. Dusty grazed peacefully, no longer restless at night. Tahu worked beside her, mending, planting, riding. Word spread that Kane's ranch was a place of fairness, where a man or woman was judged by deeds, not skin or past. Some came to trade, others just to share a meal. The land felt alive again, pulsing with hope. Margaret often caught herself smiling without meaning to, a rare and fragile thing. For the first time in years, she felt her burdens grow lighter. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Tahu led Margaret to a hill overlooking the river. The water shimmered like molten silver beneath the fading light. "My people believe rivers carry memory," he said softly. "They remember what was taken, but they also remember what was given." Margaret listened, the wind tugging her hair loose. "What do you see here?" she asked. He looked at her, steady and certain. "I see a woman who chose to give when she could have turned away." Margaret's throat tightened. She wasn't used to praise, but she didn't turn away from his gaze. That night, Margaret lay awake beneath a sky crowded with stars. She thought of the journey of ropes and trials, of battles fought in canyons and in hearts. She thought of Tahu's words, of rivers that remembered. For the first time, she let herself imagine a future not bound by loneliness, but by choice. A future where the desert wasn't empty, but shared. She turned on her side, watching Tahu sleep near the fire, his face softened by dreams. Margaret closed her eyes, her chest calm. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but she no longer feared them. She had found something worth writing for.